Okay. Thank you, everyone. Great to be here and great to see all of you here. And Devashish, welcome to Bangalore, and good to be with you after 10 years. So both of us are from the same cohort of Takshashila Institution's public policy course. So we are meeting after 10 years for this. So great to be here. So let's, as Sandhya mentioned, Jugalbandi, for example, refers to a playful sparring between two equals, right? And the idea was, we thought that it is a good metaphor to use for the discussions that we have. We said, why don't we use that to do this event? So instead of doing a conventional book conversation in which one person asks another about their book, and anyway, who has the time to attend two book conversations, we thought we'll do this in one. And we will ask questions. I will ask questions about his book and rapidly switch contexts, and he will ask questions about my book. And broadly, we are talking about public policy, so there are a lot of intersections, but there are also some differences, and hopefully we'll explore some of those in the Q&A. So that's sort of the format. It might get a bit disorienting because we are discussing two books at a time, but I'm sure it should be a good experiment to try. All right, so let's begin, Devashish, and let's begin with a very serious question, right? So you clearly love cities, and as the book shows, and your passion comes through when you write the text. So what the hell are you doing in Delhi then?
Delhi welcomes all, and I think if there's one city which has, by choice or by chance, has been accepting to all migrants and has seen multiple versions of itself, Delhi is quite a city. It has got character. It has largely fulfilled the function of a city. Now it is perhaps struggling a bit, just like other Indian cities. But I think Delhi is not too bad.
No, I agree. I was just joking. I think it's the one city of which I can say something like this and not be hounded. So that is also a positive thing about it. And yeah, I always like being there as a tourist for not more than 5 days. Okay, so less seriously, tell us 3 commonly believed ideas that you challenge in your book.
Right. There's sort of many challenges, many sort of misconceptions I've tried to challenge in the book, but 3 being, and the 3 rather very alarming notions have been: one, that we can plan for cities, we should control migration, we should try and provide all the amenities in the villages, and this humongous migration that India is seeing right now is bad. And I cannot tell you how much senior policymakers and politicians are actually talking about it, and they're still talking about it after 12 5-year plans and a couple of other NITI documents. So one is that. The other is that we should eradicate slums. I think slums are a good indicator of how a city is doing, and we can get into that part. It's perhaps controversial in my view, but I think that's one thing. And the other thing is that people think that and I mean, this is largely a hangover of whatever the independence movement was, but people think that, heart of India lives in its villages and so on and so forth, and, we should provide all those amenities there and so on. And this is where we'll find the emancipation from our issues. But I think urban areas, cities is where that will be the theater where, we'll find an emancipation from caste and gender issues and other historical wrongs that we have seen as a society and civilization. I know it's a tall remark, but I've just put it out there. That is what I believe.
But doesn't India live in its villages?
I mean, unfortunately, it does out of compulsion, but it shouldn't. They should have all the options if they want to move to a city. But we'll get there. But, you can't be let off that easy. But now you should tell me, what are the 3 things that you have really tried to push back in your book?
Yeah, so the 3 things in our book that we try to challenge are sort of, one idea is that that public policy is meant for people in the government or aspiring to be in the government. That's one idea that we challenge. Second, the idea that public policy is boring, jargon heavy. And the third idea is that the Indian state should be the primary change maker of everything good in society. So I'll just detail some of these things out. So the first one, right? Public policy is a topic meant only for people in government. That is what we try to challenge. Actually, learning public policy helps us understand what the state is relatively better at and what it is not so good at. So take a simple example, right? The government recently had a policy about mandating USB-C chargers. I think it affects all of us in a positive way, negative way, but we should know what is the impact of it. So I think that is one example why we all should know about public policy. And roughly, we often talk about civics. This is one area that we've been taught in school. But public policy goes beyond that. It talks about how do you change government, how does the policy change happen, how are positive things, when do policy failures happen, when do policy success happen. That's not something that we learn in civics and as students, right? There, the idea is there is a state and you are this distant supplicant who is just looking at the state at a distant manner. So public policy is beyond that, and that's why I think it's important for us to know. Second idea, as I said, public policy is boring. That is a common misconception. So what we try to do in this book is that public policy, first of all, literally has the word public in it. So obviously it affects a lot of us, and that's why what we've done in this book is have a lot of examples from the Indian context, not have examples which people say, like in the urban policy space, right? Bogota has great public transport and that's why we should have it here.
I would have preferred to have great case studies from India, but I can't.
Correct. So the idea is, can we tell stories from the Indian context? Yeah. And that's what we've tried to do in this book. And the third thing, to make it less jargon heavy, we've actually talked a lot about Bollywood movies. So if nothing else, what you can get from reading this book is a good Bollywood underrated movie list. So that is what I can promise. The third idea that, as I was mentioning, is about Indian state's role, right? So often we think of Indian state as the primary agent of change. That's why that mentality of a Mai Baap Sarkar as well, that the first thing happens in society, we say, okay, government should change it. What is the government doing about it? So that is again something we challenge, and that's why the book is divided into the state, society and market framework, because all three are important agents of change.
But can I push back here a bit, Pranay? Because, for a country that has seen partition, 200 years of colonial rule, and bunch of other sort of historical issues that we've been seeing, right? And some would even go on to say that, we've been under certain kind of rule for 700, 800 years, right? And that's another problem area. And where the industry is limited, people, are struggling, poor, not very educated. Don't you think that the state had a role to play to be the main provider, financer, and regulator? And now it is perhaps the benefit of 75 years of fair bit of success as compared to our South Asian neighbors, that now we can say, oh, now the state shouldn't have done so much.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can say, that's why we talk about this idea of social revolution, right? So the state took upon itself to not just do a political or economic revolution, but also a social revolution. So in a sense, that is hard-coded into our constitution, right? But yeah, now we are in 75 years, and that also had great benefits. But as we know in public policy, everything has a flip side to it as well. So the flip side of it was that state became the primary provider, producer, and that's how our relationship with the state also became, right? And that can obviously change. The 1991 reforms was one step where we thought that, now markets need to have a much more important role. So, and I think there is a third agent of change which we hardly talk about, which is society itself, right? So there are many good books recently, Raghuram Rajan's book on third pillar, Rohini Nilekani's book on Samaj Sarkar Bazaar. So in this also we've tried to explore on that angle, that what are the good things market is at providing, what are the good things that society is good at providing, and what are the good things that the state is good at providing. We need to understand that all three have their benefits, all three have their sort of shortfalls, but we need a balance between the three. And to see all three as agents of change is important. Otherwise, we just see society as a patient on which markets and state operate, right? But actually it is not so, it is an active change maker. So these are sort of the three ideas that we've tried to challenge in this book.
Okay. Three really big ideas, by the way.
Yeah. So, let me now ask you. So often in urban policy setting, right, and that is a widely discussed topic in Bangalore. So we often talk about problems and we get consumed, right? So I'll not talk about problems, but I would want to ask you broadly first. Let's think of it from an outlay, output, outcome framework. So what should be the outcome and output of urban governance according to you? Just for the benefit of everyone, Outlay, output, outcome is a common framework. Outlay refers to the amount of money and resources you put in. For example, in education, how many teachers you have is an outlay. Output is a measurable outcome, a measurable thing from what you have put on the outlay. So, for example, gross enrollment ratios would be an output. And outcome is finally the learning outcomes that people learn from the education pulse, right? What are students really learning is an outcome. So we'll apply this to the urban policy landscape. What do you think should be the outcome of urban governance and what should be the outputs? Let's not discuss how much budget is there for urban cities right away.
Right. No, so I'll start with rather outlay. Outlay is what you actually sort of put into the system, and then you get certain kind of output, and then you sort of move towards the desired outcomes. So the outlay would be, having a certain kind of certain level of trained municipal cadre, certain kind of finances, because now we don't even get, the cities do not get the share of the GSTs, and bunch of other things, right? Financing, training, human resources, certain powers, devolution, so on and so forth, right? But the output would be that you are able to provide for jobs. So essentially actually I should sort of, for people who have not read my book, I should tell you a bit about my book. So my book says that, Indian cities are India's blind spot, in the sense that, cities, or rather urbanization, is world's sort of longest running experiment, started with Harappan civilization and continuing so far. And I go on to say that we got some progressive religions like Jainism and Buddhism, and the decline of movements like communism can be attributed to the march of cities. And everything good that has come out in the world right now is because of cities. It has its own problems, but the ingenuity of humankind and the best of it resides in the urban centers, and that is where we'll find the solutions. So that is the premise, right? And that leads me to what I suggest would be the output of an urban governance is good jobs. Is like essentially 50% of the crowd here is women, essentially. And so 200 years ago, it would be, if we would have been trying to do something like this, that would have been mostly men, right? And especially from a certain community. But it is only in cities, right, where the economic identity supersedes all sorts of identities, whether it's inherited, acquired, or sort of assigned identity, right? So the output should be that you are able to do the job that you want to do at the weight you want to do and at the capabilities that you can do. So one is that, right?
So you would measure the output of any city. If you are to judge a city's success, is the number of jobs, according to you?
Not the number of jobs, but the jobs that it has been creating, it should not decline. It should steadily go up. It should move on to areas where the productivity and the wages go up. The third would be that the transaction costs or the congestion costs of, private solutions to public problems like water, a lack of water, or cost of traffic jams and so on, does not supersede the agglomeration benefits, which is the benefits of productivity gains, knowledge spillover, and so on and so forth, right? So that would be the second part, right? That the agglomeration cost should always supersede the transaction cost. There will always be transaction costs, congestion costs, and so on. But the agglomeration benefit should always outweigh. So that would be that.
Benefits of coming together should
always outweigh
the costs of good.
Absolutely. And people should be able to realize their potential in terms of what they want to do, how they want to do, to the capacity that they're not harming the other person, right? In that way, sort of, city is a microcosm of what the Constitution wants to do. And it's perhaps the best economic/administrative entity that reflects that benefit that we want to sort of derive out of a constitution. And the third part would be, and I'll move to the outcomes. The outcome would be whatever you might want to call it: ease of living, quality of life, and so on. Essentially, you are able to do the things you want to do, and you're able to pay for that. And there is problem that the government is providing for the public problems, and you are not creating private solutions to those problems, right? There's someone who could be held accountable for the city problems. It was horrendous that you were tagging chief ministers for COVID cases. And I come from Uttar Pradesh, I come from Lucknow. So you're tagging the chief minister of a state. If it would have been a country, it would have been the fourth largest country, essentially. So we are tagging that kind of person for COVID cases in certain kind of neighborhoods. So that is the kind of devolution we actually need. So we should have a mayor, council, municipal card, and so on that could be held accountable for the lack of service. So that's largely the framework for urban governance. governance. Now, but you've put me under the pressure of a framework. I know you're an engineer by training, and although you've made your name as a policy practitioner and created you, Nitin, General Menon here, have created a, very intimate community of policy professionals here in Bangalore. How does your engineering training comes into play into policy things? Because I read your book and I was going through it over the last few days because I had to keep up with you today. So, there are a lot of frameworks. What is something from your engineering training is something that you use in your policy, whether it's end cases, use cases, frameworks, applications, whatever that, you want to discuss?
Yeah. So 3 things, I think: solutions, trade-offs, and equilibrium. So I'll try to explain them. So first of all, I think engineering mindset is very helpful in public policy, and that's why we also teach about policy engineering as a discipline. Not in the sense that policy engineering is a discipline that is only required for public policy, right? As in a public policy being an applied discipline, you need knowledge from every area. But that mindset is important, and Nitin, who clapped because he's written a very nice post on this on Engineers Day on this idea, right? What is the engineering mindset? So 3 things, as I said, right? First, we think in terms of solutions, right? So the idea is, finally, policy challenges exist. They are not to be seen and wondered at that how complex it is. You need to finally move to a better equilibrium, which will not solve all your problems. So engineering gets mistaken as solutionism. It is not necessarily solutionism in the sense that no one believes that you will solve a problem completely. Yeah. But the idea is, can you move to a better equilibrium than you are? That mindset is important in any policy domain as well, right? You're not solving it, but can you reach to a better situation than you are? An example of this is economic growth, right? So this is one chapter in our book on the growth debate. So again, when we talk about economic growth, often people will say, oh no, but there are so many 10 other problems to solve. There is inequality to solve, there is environment to solve. So why should economic growth be a more important priority than this? So that, again, if you look at it from an engineering frame, you will again look at the equilibrium, right? Once you have economic growth, you will be in a better position to solve all those problems, which also are real, than you being without economic growth. So you move to a better equilibrium where you can solve, right? You will need resources for each of those problems. How will you get that? So that is one example, right? The other thing, as I said, was trade-offs, right? And engineering mindset always constrains you to think in terms of what do you have to give up in order to achieve something. So opportunity cost is again a very important concept in public policy.
But economists has already appropriated that term. Huh?
Yeah.
Engineers cannot now.
Yeah, that is opportunity cost. That's why we are talking about trade-offs. Okay. And the third one is in terms of constraints. Any engineer will think in terms of the fact that, there are constraints, there are boundary conditions. If you are designing a system, whenever you're trying to improve it on one parameter, things might get worse on another parameter, right? So this is another important concept which we often see failing in public policies. For example, a lot of our policies try to achieve too many goals with the same instrument. For example, our tax policy. The one reason why it is very complicated is because we want to achieve 30 goals with one instrument, right? So we want to achieve not just get more revenue, but we also want to do balanced regional development, X, Y, Z, 30 other objectives. I'm not saying those objectives shouldn't be done, but tax policy is not the best instrument to achieve that. So you limit the constraints, your design will be better, right? So let tax policies aim be to collect as much revenue as possible through the most fair means and to a way that citizens don't find it burdensome. And then you can do a lot of other things on the distribution side, right, on the expenditure side. But that's not how we think in terms of public policy. That's why all policies, when we try to think of it, they become exceedingly complicated and we try to achieve too many goals. So that is, again, if you have an engineering mindset, I think you will think in terms of these constraints. So that is my answer to this, right? Another common example of this is also traffic policing, right? What is the objective of traffic policing? Currently, it is not just about having law and order maintained on traffic. It is also about ensuring the smooth flow of traffic. And that means that's why the traffic police itself will tell you when it's crowded that break the rules, just go away, right? Like that again is an example where you're trying to achieve too many goals with one instrument and you fail. So these are some things that you can apply from an engineering perspective. Okay, so now my turn. Now my question to you about, you mentioned in the beginning about migration. But before that, let's talk about a more fundamental thing about density, right? Yeah. Somehow I feel we are uncomfortable with density and everything that links to it, such as high rises. So I think there's an inherent thing that high rises are bad, right? So is there something like an optimal density of a city, and have Indian cities already hit that density? Is my question to you.
Right. So actually, we have not. In fact, we are one of the least densities that we have in India as compared to the global counterparts. And I think the reason that we are sort of, we are sort of averse to vertical growth of cities is because there's still a massive hangover of the whole independence movement, and we still we derive a sense of land from our understanding of what is largely rural political economy. So in rural political economy, in rural areas, we usually look at a land and you say, okay, I can practice agriculture in this land and this will be the output and so on and so forth. So the horizontal element of the land is usually the case. But in urban areas, it's largely the vertical element that comes into place. So the quantity of the land remains the same, but the supply can go up. There's environmental impact of it, there's financing impact of it, then there's density impact of it, and so on and so forth, right? And one of the most common instrument that is used is FSI, or FAR as we also call it. Its floor area ratio is depending upon your size of your plot, how much of area that you can build over it, right? The average FSI in global cities which are economic powerhouses ranges anywhere between 5 to 15. It goes up to 25 and 22 in Singapore and Hong Kong, but largely it is between 5 to 15. In India, the average is around 1.3. Right, most of the cities, and usually what happens is FSI goes up as a country grows and city grows with it. Right, in India it has happened the opposite way. In Bombay, the FSI declined, whereas in Shanghai it went up, and that's why the per capita space that is available to you, that goes down. So that is one problem, right? Then in Bangalore, the FSI is 4.
So you're actually agreeing that we hate density?
We do. We do. Well, no, we hate densities because our understanding of land comes from what is largely rural political economy. We need to understand, and that's why this book attempts to say that the urban political economy is very different from rural political economy and all the challenges. And it's a very tall statement that I'm making right now, that, or rather, majority of all our current challenges are largely urban in nature, right? Most of the challenges are largely urban in nature, and that's why you have to have a different interpretation of Indian political economy from the urban lens, where we say, okay, we can grow vertically, there's nothing wrong with it. The rental yields will be healthy. The prices of acquiring an apartment or a villa or a plot will go down. FSI should go up, and so on. And that's the problem, because in Bangalore the FSI is 4. And if you really want to compete with NYC or Chicago or a Tokyo or a Singapore, there the FSI goes from 12, 15, 18, 22, 25. And that's why, and I do not live in Bangalore, I keep visiting here because of my family. I have seen that there are large parts of what could be categorized as a CBD, Central Business District, in a city. And for Bangalore, and that is what scholars like Alan Butler have said, that in Indian cities, the FSI goes up at the edges of the city, in the suburban areas, wherein largely in these mainstream cities, I'm telling you, these rather quote-unquote successful cities, the FSI goes up in the central part of the town, right? And that's why we have to change that dialogue as well. And in Bangalore also, that's a problem. Now, Bangalore property market is overheated for the last 18 months, 6 quarters, and will continue to be heated up until we liberalize FSI. But of course, there's certain things would come with that, is like you have to provide for trunk infrastructure and public transport. The road width currently in Bangalore does not support that high FSI. But in Hyderabad, they have been able to successfully liberalize FSI. In Hyderabad, I think they've removed the FSI limits. So you can purchase for it so far as you have certain permits and there's certain trunk infrastructure, you can go for it. But now, because I'm talking about practical things, I'm going to ask for, because you've talked a lot of theory now. Sorry, Pranay. Now I'll ask for a practical example from you. Suggest me, like, tell me two policies at the central government level and at the state level, Karnataka here in your case, which you think are success when it comes to achieving high economic growth. I know it's a quick jump from my discussing Bangalore and Hyderabad, but I really wanted to focus on this because you have used a lot of frameworks. You've discussed a lot of policies which are bad. Tell policies which are good as per you at the central level and at the Karnataka level.
Yeah.
And it's government agnostic, by the way.
Before going to that question, I'll just switch context again to what you were saying earlier, right? In the book, we have also a chapter on Abadi isn't Barbad.
Yeah.
And one thing we also discuss there, we quote a statement which I found very useful to think about, that if India had the density of Singapore, all of India's population would fit in the size of Kerala, right? So we are not that dense.
Exactly.
Second, is also one common misconception. Actually, southern Indian states are on the average more dense than northern Indian states. And there's a great book on this by Samuel Paul and Kailash Sridhar, an old book on paradox of north and south, and in which they argued that one of the reasons why southern Indian states also did better was because they were more compact. And I mean 60-70 years ago, also remember that the state's reach was not very much, right? If you were far away, you were out of the vision of the state. But the fact that we had compact states also benefited. So that's one thing to think of. I don't think many people think on those lines. So yeah, density is good, and I think we've not reached at least the optimal density level.
Oh, we are far from it. We are far from it. But we also, before that, we have to change the narrative part of it, that why density is good. Density is good for environment. It can be achieved, and why it would also be good for state exchequer as well.
Yeah. So before I answer that question, just we'll detail this a bit. You said density is good for environment. Yeah. Can you just detail that? Because I know you've quoted, by the way, his book it's like a textbook for learning urban governance. There are quotes and there are learnings from a whole lot of scholars from everyone. And unlike a textbook, it's not boring. So,
I'm glad you said it. I was waiting for that.
And so in that, you also said there is, you had a quote by Edward Glaser, right? Yeah. Well-known economist, urban economist. So he writes about that cities are our greatest invention that can make us greener too. So explain this.
So look, the choice is not between the perfect city and a suboptimal city, right, in terms of functioning. The choice is between rural areas and urban areas, right? And that's why you see when you have densities, you can sort of reduce the greenhouse gas emissions fair bit. So essentially 80%, 85% of the emissions globally come from cities because those are economic powerhouses. It's fairly logical. So what do we do about it? So every urbanization sort of story, I'm not talking about ancient civilizations, the recent ones, whether it is European or after that it was North American, and now then there was East Asian and now Indian. All of these large urbanization stories, they sort of left an impact on what is urbanization, and they sort of added their own flavor to it. The Indian flavor to it would be being highly resource efficient, right? And I think we have shown great success on the energy efficiency schemes and so on, right? So once you have a dense city, right, when the density goes up, your traveling distance would really go down. Now, the other problem with Bangalore is, I know everyone's talking about Trevor Noah, the concert and the traffic problem and so on, is because people from Whitefield and people from Yelahanka and they all, because that's where the density is up. They're traveling to the part where that show was going to happen. So once it's dense, you can effectively use public transport. You would not have to use private transport as much first. Second, the cost and the environment, the financial cost and the environmental cost of providing that infrastructure, trunk infrastructure, would be better for those dense areas. Third, 1/3 of New Yorkers actually use private vehicles for trips, as compared to rest of America, which is 86% of the trips are actually used through private vehicles, right? So and New York is known to be a dense city. So if it's a dense city, your emissions so on will go down. So at multiple levels, you can actually reduce your carbon footprint, your footprint on land in terms of how much of land you're consuming and so on, would actually reduce. And that's why densification would actually would lead to very high resource efficiency, and that would be good for environment, because whether we like it or not, we are urbanizing. But how do we want to urbanize is something our choice. So we will anyway urbanize and we'll consume way more resources than we want to admit or that we want to sort of, largely admit. But we can flip the way we are consuming those resources in terms of which the efficiency can go up. And that's my point to it, that densification would lead to less environmental cost as compared to urban sprawl.
Right. And yeah, I'm sure there'll be questions on this. We can talk about this.
By the way, my parents are here today, so please be kind to me. Huh?
No, don't be. So,
don't be. Wow.
So, I was talking, you had asked about two policies. Actually, the book, to be fair, doesn't talk a lot about policy successes. We've largely talked about failures. Maybe the next book will be about that. But this is on, so two things which I would say would be, I think union government, I would put GST as a thing. I'm only limiting to economic policy. I think even though it has a lot of issues, but we are again talking in terms of, is it better off than the status quo and the alternative we had at that time, right? Compared to that, I think GST is an improvement. It will have economic benefits. And it's not just about the policy, but the fact that you could get all states and union government on board. You did a new institutional innovation of the GST Council, where all states have equal power. That is an interesting experiment, and I think it has made things better off than they were earlier. It has
not for cities though. Cities don't get a share of GST revenues.
So you can have your grouses there. Yeah. So that's true, and especially the idea is it's a journey, right? The next thing would be that you should also have one portion of that SGST going to cities. But okay, that's one. In terms of the state policies, I'm again looking at economic policy. I think the next area for Karnataka would be looking at hardware, and I was looking also about semiconductors. That's one of my areas. Karnataka state had a semiconductor policy since 2010. And since it is a topic that everyone is talking about, all of India's whatever semiconductor design happens in this city, right? So a lot of things related to it, not just the design element, but manufacturing, iPhone production, manufacturing hardware for aerospace.
So do you think PLI is a good scheme, or it has the potential?
PLI again has. I think PLI is a band-aid which you need given every other country is doing that, but it is not solution for, and it is not a Karnataka government scheme. But Karnataka government has done one interesting thing in this. I think they have something like a semiconductor fabless accelerator lab. It is the only state government I know which has this, where they are providing common facilities for startups who want to do design, which is very costly, incurs a lot of cost, so not many companies come up. Yeah. So there's a unique partnership between the industry and the government where they are trying to set up something. And I think that would be required for many other cutting edge areas, right, where Karnataka's comparative advantage lies in Bangalore. So space, there might be something like this in space, aerospace, lots of hardware things. So I think these are two things which I think on union and state level which are important. So let's move again, context switch to your book. What are some policies, and you've detailed it a lot in the book, that create an artificial scarcity of land? Because that's where we talked about on density. So what are some of those policies?
Right. So land, again, very contentious issues. And in fact, we all keep talking about reforms and so on. And urban land, I mean, if you all want to take one of the takeaways from today's conversation is what we need to do on urban land and how it sort of feeds into the reform 2.5, 3.0, whatever you want to call it, feeds into that. So because we have not fulfilled the agenda on that part, urban land. So a bunch of policies actually. So one is the Rent Control Act, which essentially put a ceiling on how much rent hike you can undertake over years. And a lot of movies in 60s, 70s, 80s, some of them you have also cited in your book, have sort of described that how it created perverse incentives for landlords not to renovate the properties and for tenants not to increase the sort of rent on their own, and how that locked a lot of property, first in disputes and second in being in very dilapidated state, right? So that's one problem.
Do all our cities still have rent control acts?
A lot of cities actually. So Rent Control Act has to be promulgated at the state level. So a lot of states have actually started undertaking those reforms. And I believe Rajasthan, Odisha, these are some of the states which have already started taking, Telangana, these are some of the states which have undertaken some reforms on the Rent Control Act. So one is that. The other is master planning, which is like the key tool to sort of decide the direction of a city. Essentially, it has 20-25 year horizon, and the exercise to sort of create a master plan that is accepted by all and is put into place and practice takes 10 to 15 years anyway. And then you have a time horizon of 20 to 25 years. By then, the economic nature of a city, in fact, forget about the city, about the country has really changed, right? About the region that has really changed, at the international level that has changed, right? So you're planning for something that is already outdated, and you freeze the land because the transaction cost of changing the land use is highly costly. And second, the Sarkar has really intervened so much in urban planning that you really have to grease a lot of palms to sort of get things rolling, right? So for instance, mixed-use neighborhood has now become a thing in India. It was initially a thing in India in 40s, 50s, 60s, but then we thought that no, we should have segregated use, and that created a bunch of problems, including increasing vehicle ownership, more emissions, highly inefficient utilization of land. So one is master planning. It has to be way more dynamic, right? And the third that I would say is there's a lot of land. In fact, I will say two more things. One is property taxes. We are actually not taxing properties. In 2008, we had 240 categories, and we had 100 plus exemptions for the kind of properties that do not have to pay property taxes, including temples and so on. I think everyone should pay property taxes if you're in an urban area first, right? So that also creates perverse incentive to sort of inefficiently utilize the land. And second, the last point would be that how enormous amount of land still lies with public sector enterprises that is not used. I mean, State Bank of India, Air India, BHEL, BEL, enterprises that are defunct now. They have thousands of acres of hectares of land, right? That is not being used. It is either encroached upon, it is abandoned or underutilized. So that is one inventory that we can use. And I think Takshashila Institution has done a lot of work in terms of talking about how to efficiently utilize that land. So yeah, that would be.
I will just add to it. So we've tried to capture this based on a movie, a 1984 movie called Mohan Joshi Hazir Ho. So that's cited in this book. So it's interesting, right? A lot of movies will get the policy problem right, but they'll get the solution absolutely wrong. So this movie is also similar. The movie is quite fun. The idea is that there's a couple who's living in this dilapidated Mumbai building, and the villain in that is Amjad Khan, who is the landlord, right? So this landlord has built this, and obviously has no incentive to maintain that because the money he's getting from that renting out is meager, penny. So he's not maintaining that at all. So obviously these guys file a case on him. So both the lawyers on both sides milk them dry, and finally they lose the case. And eventually the landlord wins, and in the end, I will not say the end, because you can go and watch the movie. But whatever it is, the idea is in this movie, the solution given was that there's this rapacious landlord who's colluding with these business interests, and that's why he doesn't want to maintain that area, right? But actually he is also a victim of incentives, right? If he's not going to get any money or any benefits from maintaining that, or you are going to cap rents and he's going to get pennies for it, why will he do anything to improve that particular property? So that is one thing. So again, this solution was not discussed in the movie, but I think it got the policy problem right. So you could at least watch the movie. It is quite good.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it does reflect how inefficiently we utilize land in urban areas. And again, I'll go back to the element of vertically utilizing land, and how, Bombay mills, because of the whole bit of nationalization and so on, were abandoned. And now you see how they are sort of turned into, fashion houses and, very, very classy cafes and, chic restaurants and so on. This is what Bombay has done with the textile mills. But see what Kanpur has done. Nothing, literally. Those mills are just dying, rotting there, and they're occupying the land, and there are no taxes being paid, no employment, no economic activity coming out of those activity of that parcel of land. So we really need to be very creative on how we want to use land. Pranay, going back to your book, there are two things, and I want to sort of challenge few things in your book. First is, you talk about this framework which has got a lot of acceptance, Sarkar, Samaj and Bazaar, but it seemed to me from your book that it was fairly domestic in nature and, for the lack of a better word, inward looking. You did not discuss international actors as much, and I don't know, where would you put a Taliban or an Elon Musk or say World Economic Forum and other factors that are also influencing policy making in the country first, and second, for someone who is again, for the lack of a better word, so obsessed with the role of state, the corruption was not discussed with as much detail, or for some reason it was under the table, even in the book. So,
yes.
so
not there at all.
Yeah. So why don't you sort of elaborate on those 2 points?
Actually, I don't think corruption is that important an issue, in the sense that corruption.
No, I think it is good.
No, I don't think it is good.
It reduces the transaction cost. It's like a lubricant for governance.
So I think corruption, first of all, is there as part of every society. Yeah. I think there's a great book on this by Wen Ang, who's a Chinese political economist, and there's a book called China's Gilded Age. So in that, she has a nice framework to think about corruption. So there are sort of 4 kinds of corruption, right? One kind of corruption is when elites do corruption in order to provide some service. So basically getting contracts, etc. So that is called access money. Okay. Right. The second one is when non-elites do that to provide some service. So that is called speed money. So right, RTO, you go give me some money, then you will get the license. That's an example of that. The third kind of corruption is where elites do take money for not providing any service. They're just thieving money away. So that is called grand theft in her terminology, and embezzlement is a classic example of that. And the fourth one, you will be petty theft, where again a non-elite is engaging in a theft. For example, cuts given to a police person to actually engage in a legit business would be an example of this. So now, these are all forms of corruption, right? Now, what her insight was also that you don't actually get rid of corruption. And anyways, what it moves to is it moves from petty corruption and speed money to access money. And right now, in India, we have still the petty money element is there and access money, both are there. Now, what can change it is, I think, I see it, corruption simply from the lens of incentives. If you change incentives, corruption can reduce, right? It's one of those problems where you don't attack the problem directly. It's like immigration, right? Immigration, probably you can say it's better if people stay back in India. You can't solve that by banning people from going out of India. Similarly, corruption you can't solve by saying you will have a Lokpal and it'll solve. Like, I mean, it was tried, it didn't work. So what you will think in terms of 2 ways, right? Competition and technology, probably. Competition, for example, right? Just look at within government itself. Now there are 3 oil marketing companies, right? When you have a competition within government entities, and probably if you can bring a private competitor as well, there's less incentive to be corrupt, right? You have to report to something. That's why OMCs within the government do still perform better than some of the other PSUs which don't have government competition. And then it's technology again, right? The fact that we have new instruments to directly transfer money, etc., reduces that petty money kind of option where there was discretion which was necessary to transfer money. So that's why I see it as a problem of incentives. It doesn't require a specific chapter in a public policy book.
So probably next edition might have it.
No,
it won't have it. Okay, but do you want to talk about the international players?
Yeah. So, this book is largely focused on the domestic angle. So that's why we were thinking of the state, market, society angle in a domestic lens. But obviously the state is the primary actor when it comes to international affairs. Even society, for example, we are in a very global city, and there is an interaction of the society with others as well. And there is an additional element of the fact that because we are on social media, we are also interacting with the world outside. We are sometimes importing problems and ideas from there, right? Like, I don't understand how we can talk about degrowth in India. Yeah. But we are part. So, and market, of course, have a lot of linkage, which we actually need to intensify much more than there. So, all three of them have an element of international interactions. But we didn't consider it as a part of this because we were largely focused on domestic change. How does change happen in the domestic arena? That's
fair. Thank you.
Okay, so now my turn. We were talking about this idea, right? This migration idea is one thing that I wanted to talk about in detail. Let me go to that. Right. So there is a counter view. Okay, so I mean, all of us would probably agree migration is good, but here's a counter view. Because if there is ungated migration, there is a lot, there might be norms that you will import which will actually degrade a city. Okay,
right.
So the idea is you don't stop migration, but you put some entry barriers so that you are still maintaining the goodness in that city, quote unquote goodness in that city. So what is the problem with this kind of thing?
It's criminal to think of something like this. I know I went a little extreme in saying that, but I tell you why. Because we are all here because someone, in a family, so one of our forefathers migrated from a village to a small town, and then someone migrated from a small to a larger town, and they all got educated in the process, got some decent jobs, they gave us better opportunities, and that's how we all ended up here, right? We are able to do what we want to do, and at the wages that we want to do, and we are also hopefully able to innovate or at least increase productivity wherever we are, right? And to deny others the chance to move to a city where their economic identity will supersede of all the three other identities that I talked about is almost criminal. You won't have a Nawazuddin Siddiqui or a Dhirubhai Ambani if you stop migration like that. It's criminal, first thing. Second thing, how, as I said, right, and we have to flip the way we approach cities, and because of the 5-year plans, and how because of UK had that Country and Town Planning Act that we sort of inherited, they have reformed, we have not, is where we sort of see cities as spatial entities or other physical spaces that can direct economic activities, whereas the idea should be that cities are economic entities where the spatial sort of manifestation should facilitate the economic exchange, right? So you have to flip that whole argument, and if you do that, the more migrants come to your city, it means that your city is doing well. And that's why when I said that slums are good, because it shows that anyone who might have 2 hectares of land and can lie in a charpai in somewhere in UP Bihar is still struggling to be in a slum in Vasant Kunj and is ready to pay 500 rupees for I don't know, a 200 square foot room in a slum, because they think that they still have a better chance at life, in career, and for their family, for their coming generations by virtue of being in a certain city that provides that kind of exchange, right? So I think one should not gatekeep who can come to city and who cannot. In fact, that also goes contrary to your book's argument, where the role of state should not be in things that, where it shouldn't be, right? And here we will again create another state which would say that, you can come to the city and you cannot. This would also be a form of what Chinese have, a hukou system, where they say that, oh, you are a urban hukou holder now and not a rural hukou holder, and now you can access certain kind of services. What happened in China until a couple of years ago, until 3-4 years ago, they had 200 million illegal sort of immigrants there. Illegal immigrants is, I don't know, I mean, until it's international, I think it's quite an oxymoron. It's ironic, it shouldn't exist. And the problem that they're facing in China, we would face in India, and worse still because it's a democracy. So, and you cannot control a lot of these things. So, and hence that argument of that, why we should not gatekeep who can come to a city and who cannot. How they assimilate is a different argument. How migrants can move from low productivity jobs to better productivity jobs or higher wages is another argument. How they sort of contribute to the samaj or the bazaar at large after they have moved to a city is another argument. How they move from slum to affordable housing and then eventually to the housing of their choice is another argument. But to gatekeep who can come to city is again, as I would say, it's criminal. And I'm saying this with as much passion because I've heard many senior policymakers and politicians say that we should control migration, and I think it is not the right thing to do. But I think at this moment we should perhaps pause for a second and check, because our debate has been continuing for many years now. But I don't know if people have questions, we can continue debating.
Yeah, another 5 minutes we can open it up to the people. Or if there are any questions we can take, and then we can go back.
Because we can keep, we have read each other's work, so we can keep going on.
Hi, I'll bring the mic around to anyone who has a question. I request you to keep your question short and direct it to either Devashish or Pranay.
Thank you so much. I'm Kushagra Bansal. So either of you can answer this question. So in the Parliament and Lok Sabha across the states, we have a lot of politicians who are, either uneducated or undereducated. So do you think that this factor plays a big role in the way policies are formed? Any kind of policy, whether it be economic, social, or development for that matter?
I think no. I don't think it's a big enough problem. The thing is, the way we would study the role of a politician is someone who makes coalitions happen, right? There are divergent interests, and the job of politics, when politics wins and when you don't need wars for it, is because politicians will be able to map whatever interests are diverging, find out a middle path, and have a solution which works largely for a large number of people. None of this requires you to have a BTech degree. Yeah. Right? In fact, that might actually take in the other direction. So that's why I would say that I don't think that is that is an important factor. As long you have interacted with a lot more of politicians than I have. So
yeah, no, I would say that you are attaching, and we all do actually, a certain kind of value judgment to being educated and not being educated. As if like being educated makes you much more understanding to what is needed by the people, and you have your ear to the ground and so on and so forth. But that's actually not the case. I mean, it's good to have. Probably you can. You might have certain frameworks in mind to proceed with, but it's not, as he said, it's not that big a problem, because if we remove the value judgment of it, what really matters is how well you can do your job, and a master's or a graduate degree is not really an important aspect of that. First. Second is, I have 2 policy degrees. He's trained in engineering. He's a better policy mind than me in my eyes, right? Really 2 degrees. It's unfortunate. And also studied at Takshashila Gharana, right? So technically 3 forms of training in policy. And this guy has not done a training in policy, but he's
more of a politician. I should contest elections.
No, that would be policy's loss. So he should not.
Any other questions? Sure.
Hi, this question is for Devashish. So labor force dependence hasn't really translated the same way economic growth has, right? Across sectors, in that a significant portion of our labor force is dependent on agriculture, whereas it contributes less and less to GDP as we develop. Is there a way cities can provide like a driving change to that specific disparity?
Right. So this is like the biggest problem that successive governments over the last 3-4 decades are sort of engaging with. The problem is that we have not created enough jobs in the manufacturing sector. I think it still contributes 15 to 17% to the GDP. We want to take it to 25% by 2025. Again, we are far removed from it. And the first is this problem. The second problem is because we have created over decades many perverse incentives for the manufacturing units to remain sort of small, micro, small, medium enterprises, which is also called the midget problem. And unless you sort of go for scale and globally competitive manufacturing firms, you will not be able to create that kind of employment. So it is largely a policy question, and there's also a contest between, because there are certain policy thinkers like Raghuram Rajan who still think that, because we are doing so well in service and service exports, we should continue focusing on that. But the majority of employment generation, or not majority, but the more sort of engagement on employment comes from the manufacturing industry, right? So a lot of people are still saying that we should, pivot towards manufacturing and keep focusing on it until we get a game right. And PLI and phase manufacturing policy and so on. There are multiple policies which are focusing on creating manufacturing-led jobs. It will be created in cities. There's no way it can be created in rural areas. As I said, all major problems of India right now are largely urban problems. It will be created, all those manufacturing units will be either in suburban areas or industrial towns or across what we have golden quadrilateral, is that what we have, and then New Delhi, Bombay Industrial Corridor, and there are multiple corridors that are being developed. Along those routes, there are industrial cities where these manufacturing units will be set up. They will plug and play for Indian and global companies. But again, the solution will be in the urban areas. Rural areas do not have that sort of capacity, whether it's power supply, labor market, and other sort of enforcement and regulation to sort of provide a conducive environment for a manufacturing unit to scale up. So sorry, it's a rushed up answer, but I hope it suffices.
Yeah. I'll just ask a connected question and then we'll proceed to this. Why don't you explain to us why are clusters important, right? If there are always clustering happens. Everyone thinks we need to have balanced regional development, but even in the US there are high-tech clusters are only 2 or 3. There's Boston for biotech, there is San Francisco for IT, etc., right? But we have a lot of policies which always think of, okay, can we replicate Bangalore's IT success in Dhar? Can we move same things here? Can we create another Bangalore? And I'm sure they are there in many other states as well. So why are clusters important, and why does clustering also happen?
Right. So there was this economist, I think his name was Alfred Marshall, I think, and he said one of the quotes that in cities, it seems that the tricks of the trade are in the air. So that's why clustering is important, because what is clustering? Clustering is geographic concentration of firms, suppliers, labor market, even customers, and other associated industries, forward or backward linkage. So that is what a clustering is, right? What does cluster really do? One, there's a knowledge spillover, right? We are here, so you would have picked up what is there to know about public policy, or some bit about why urbanization is important, right? One part is that. The other is productivity gains. When we are sort of clustered together, we know we pick something from our colleagues, from our roommates, and then we sort of go on and contribute at work. Then we learn from our bosses, and then we sort of keep engaging on that part, right? So there's productivity gains. Of course, there's innovation, because there are people clustered together and they're innovating, they're researching, and so on, right? And there are other positive externalities that come out of it. And that's why clustering is sort of important. And that's why, and clusters are very difficult to dismantle, and they're even more difficult to create. So now Bangalore example is a success, because back in 1902, the Diwans of which was the Mysore province, right, decided that we will have a dam at a river, I'm forgetting its name, and to ensure that there will be continuous power supply. There are multiple, especially Sir MV, multiple PM, Prime Ministers of this Mysore province, continue to invest in industrialization and education and providing for other sort of public goods. When they did that, post-independence and around independence, it was a very fertile ground to create industries for heavy industries, right? I think Bharat Electronics was here, Hindustan Aeronautics, BHEL, right? They all came here, so that created a fertile ground. And that's how cluster does it, right? A cluster moves from one activity to another, where the productivity gains are going up, the wage is going up, the innovation is going up, the labor market is getting thicker and thicker, and that's the whole idea of a cluster. Boston's cluster, you know how it started? One guy, I mean, it started because of a variety of factors and largely because of academic institutions. But one of the very unlikely factors was there was a guy sent by a pharma company to be in Boston areas, but he couldn't find the suppliers and researchers and academicians and so on. So what he created yellow pages for those people, and they started coming together, and that sort of created the whole idea of Mass Medic, which is an organization that anchors Boston cluster, right? And that's why clustering is important. And you see that Bangalore has reached where it has reached in 2023 for what has been going on over the past 100, 125 years, right? And that's why it is not very easy that in Dharwad or Hubli you'd be able to create a parallel cluster. What may happen is that there might be associated activities, and if there is hyper connectivity, and there's enough sort of public goods there for people to reside there, and for them to consider that the congestion cost and the transaction cost of being there does not supersede the agglomeration benefits of being there, then there might be certain transfer of cluster. And Singapore was one cluster. Again, Singapore story is very hackneyed. Let me not go there. But Dutch example of their cluster on flowers. It's insane because flowers perish very soon. But they crop those flowers, they pack those flowers, they do the packaging, the cutting, and they customize it and they send it all over the world. And that's how well they operate, right? So clusters are very difficult to create. They're very difficult to sort of destroy, but if you give enough sort of a conducive environment, they move to higher productivity and higher wage sort of value chain. And that's why it's not very, and it starts with either a marquee investor or investment in education or certain geopolitical forces or certain kind of other factors, including weather. Actually, that has a role to play in that.
Yeah, so replicating clusters is difficult. So if we think Bangalore has grown too much, why can't we just take a portion of it and move it to another place and it will work as fine as it works now?
I think,
that won't.
So what will happen is that where we'll try to take that cluster, that city will also not succeed and the Bangalore cluster will also decline.
Okay. All right, next question is there.
Hi, I'm Akshay. I was part of Takshashila Institution's last cohort 35. So
Enough people to heckle us.
So yeah, I've met Pranay online, but it's nice to meet both of you in person.
Thank you.
My question is to Devashish. I just flew in from Delhi last night, and I'm looking for rental housing here. And the rental markets are vastly different. The houses are much nicer here for more reasonable rents, but there's a much higher deposit and all of that. So do you think it's just land availability, or there are other factors that make the rental market so very different?
There are multiple factors at play. I think having the higher deposit money is because the crowd is younger here and they're moving very fast. The attrition is fast, right? And that's why the landlords try to create a certain kind of stickiness for people to stay back. And so I think that's the part of the problem. I think that was also the problem in 2000s in Bombay, where they call it pagdi, but it will be 11-month pagdi, that 11 month of deposit that you have to give. I don't think it's that bad in Bangalore, or I hope. Is it that bad? 6? Oh. We are getting there. So there are multiple roles, things at play. So one is Rent Control Act. The second is, again, so ideally the density of a city should be, an inverted V. So around the central business district or a certain area in the central of the city, that's where the density should be high, the FSI should go up and then should go down. But what happens in Indian cities, it's like a U. So in the central business district or the other parts where the elites are staying because they cannot, tolerate the lesser mortals like us, so they keep the density down. But at the periphery of the cities, they sort of increase the density. So it's like a U where the density goes up at the end, right? And now that's the problem, because you want to stay, say, in Indiranagar or a Koramangala or a place which is close to your place of work. You want to be in the center, right? Or at least close to your place of work. And the problem is that there is a paucity of rental housing there, right? And that's why part of the thing, my book that also discusses, among other issues, is that policy incentives has sort of created perverse incentives towards ownership as compared to access. We should prioritize access over ownership, right? And that should come in form of rental housing, dormitory housing, and so on. I mean, so someone to ask me, like, what should Bangalore do about in terms of rental housing for rents, apart from the urban land reforms, apart from moving Kent away from city, which is Nitin's, I think came from your op-ed. I've liberally cited you in that idea. The other would be about creating dormitory housing, affordable rental housing complexes, and so on. I mean, it is not surprising that Surat picked picked it up after the central government did some policy in COVID that, we should have affordable rental housing complex. Surat picked it up because in Surat, 65% of the population is actually migrant population. And there was an unrest being created during COVID because they had nowhere to go, right? So there are multiple factors at play, but I told you some of the solutions that can go with it and why the inverted we and the you are actually part of the problem. So I hope that answers that question. Well, I wish I could solve his problem and mine too.
Hi, my question's to Devashish. Hi. Welcome to Bangalore, first and foremost. So happy to host you here. The city is a bit of a dichotomy at the moment. We have one of the most active civil societies and civic activism, but we haven't had a municipal council election for 3 years, COVID, etc., but mostly because the MLAs don't want to give up power. So quick question, you've written a chapter on urban governance, and I was wondering, is there anything that you can suggest to Bengaluru in specific on how we can sort of, what is the lever? Is it only political will? How do we go from this sort of deadlock that we have in urban governance? Does it have to be a top-down sort of political initiative, or is there anything else that we can look into? And second, very quick question at the peril of being politically incorrect. Entry barrier to migrants is, yes, I agree, it's absolutely criminal. I wonder, is integration, to borrow from the European sort of lingo, is that a more feasible thing? And Karnataka government has tried something like that with respect to language, but in educational institutions, pushing people to learn Kannada specifically. But is this, can we say this out loud, is integration something that we should be thinking about, given local sentiments and the amount of migration happening in the city?
Right. Thank you, Surbhi. Surbhi is my batchmate from our years at Cambridge. Surbhi, two very loaded questions. So I'll start with this idea that, a very engaged or informed or a high energy civil society does not really mean very efficient public policy. San Francisco is a case where the rents are actually very problematic, and housing is a major issue in San Francisco, and so is law and order. So that is, that's no correlation first. Second, I always tell people that the next hero of Indian policy making would be a chief minister, she or he, the one who will undertake devolution to cities and will undertake the reforms as enshrined in the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act. That person will not get re-elected because that would have given a power, and they would not be able to sort of exercise as much corruption or extract resources from cities. So I'm very certain that that person will not get re-elected. But it will set in motion a cycle that will be very difficult to pull back. That's the very critical thing about Indian policy making. Once you go on a certain path, there's a certain path dependency, and if you go back from it, it will create a bunch of problems, including there are other I can examples that I can give you that we went down on certain path. It was very difficult for us to pull back, right? So it has to come from a chief minister. So the next hero or heroine would be of policy making would be that chief minister who has to bite the bullet. There's no other option, and that's why I say that even those indirectly elected mayors, and the richer the city, the weaker the mayor is, by the way, and the lower is the tenure. The Janagra has done a study. I don't know if Janagra folks are here, but so that's one problem of that part. And about the issue of integration, I think, and I did mention it to Pranay, that assimilation is a separate question. So you should not gatekeep it, but assimilation is something that is also good for migrants. If suppose they learn the language, Kannada, right, and suppose if they imbibe with the culture, right, I think that is good for the city. And forget about the city for a minute. It's good for migrants because then they can move around for housing, for accessing credit, for accessing housing, for accessing education. It would be good for them, and it would be easier for them to move from a job which is unskilled, say a security guard or a delivery person, to a semi-skilled job, and so on and so forth. So I am in favor of reasonable assimilation, because again we have to attach this word reasonable in India, because a single word can go either way in Indian policy making, a long way rather.
This, I think NITI Aayog taught you this, huh?
Or I taught that to NITI Aayog.
No, just to add to that question I had, but there's a very nice observation by the tax economist Raja Chalai a long time ago, that everyone wants decentralization, but only to their own level. Right? So what the question she asked, why would anyone do that? You'll have to give a Bharat Ratna or something like that. Only then it will happen. But there have been some attempts at the union government level, like our finance commission grants, if they are tied to some devolution, those have been some attempts, people have been pushing for that. Do you think there is some future to those kinds of ideas?
I think there was this 1919 Act, Montague Act or something, 1919, right? That was very empowering for urban local bodies, right? But the 1935 Government of India Act actually took away those powers because, again, the bunch of crisis that was going on because of the freedom struggle, and they took it back, and that's what we inherited in 1947. We built on that. That historical sort of issue got corrected when in 93-94 we had the Constitutional Amendment Act. In 95, the first time the funds were started giving out for reforms. It was in 2002 that Atal Bihari Vajpayee said that, we'll undertake these reforms and we'll pay you for money, this much money for undertaking these reforms. JNNURMs, smart cities, Amrit, they're all sort of activities, the programs, the schemes to encourage for those reforms, but it has to come from a chief minister's, and it will come at a point where the transaction cost will all over sort of overwhelm the agglomeration benefits so much so that they will have to do it. I mean, COVID was an example where they could have done it. Of course, no one does it. But I think still the transaction costs are still lower than agglomeration benefits because where we are in development trajectory. But once the stakes keep on getting higher, it will happen.
So you mean we need more Trevor Noah cancellations to happen? Then change will happen.
More Trevor Noah cancellations? No, more. I think big firms moving out of cities would send a very, very strong signal, and a big scandal, I think that might help.
House rent control essentially was there to allocate the houses. So essentially the people from the village would flock for employment or, give an application and get their houses. But nowadays I heard that when Parliament has passed some bill, the Model Tenancy Act, wherein it says that if by end of an year, on the 12th month, if you're not vacating, you're entitled to pay 4 times the rent. So, how is this justified? There should be some responsibility in allocating the houses for the, the underprivileged ones, which they're not, having any concern on it. But straightly they're just driving to extract 4 times the rent on the 12th month just because you're not vacating the premises. So
I'll go first and then you please pitch in because your book has also discussed it in greater detail. I think that the Model Tenancy Act, the eviction happens if you're in violation of the contract. It does not automatically evict you first. Second, if you've signed the contract, you would have sort of, the tenant and the landlord would have agreed on how much would be the rent sort of increase and what are the other terms of exchange, right, in terms of leasing that house. So that's the other part. So if you are in violation of the agreement, then there's, and it has Model Tenancy Act that's why it's a model act. The states will have to adopt it and they can adopt at whatever level. So I doubt that Model Act alone would have mentioned the 4 times of the rent. I think they might have suggested a range or something, but the Model Act usually it does not, but I'm not sure. I've not seen that act. So first part is that. Second is if you've already signed the contract, so you know what are the terms, right? Third, if there has to be a purpose for economically weaker sections and low-income groups, it has to come in the form of affordable rental housing complexes. Why should the burden be borne by a person who has put their life savings to buy a plot of land and then develop the property, and then they're stuck with the tenant who will not increase the rent first or will not evict the property voluntarily? So that's why it's the burden of providing that affordable rental housing lies with the state, not with the private individual, is my understanding.
I would address it slightly differently.
Please go ahead.
So, for example, we can look at broadly all governments have 3 types of things they can do, right? Produce, finance, regulate. So either you're producing something or you're financing the recipient or you're regulating that area. Now, in this particular thing, I don't think the state needs to necessarily allocate housing at all. They can probably do the financing part, right? So, for example, if you are able to transfer the money to economically weaker sections, then they can choose the land or the place they want. You don't need to produce that housing unit for a person to do that, because once you get government into production, there are a lot of other complications, right? What will be the quality, then your element of corruption, all those things. So can you think in terms of finance and regulation? Even regulation is the other important element, right? Like we were discussing, why is the rent cost high? It is high because there is limited amount of housing units. If you have, through regulatory policies, you are increasing that supply, obviously the prices will go down, right? So that is what, so we have to think in terms of what more can government do in terms of finance and regulate in housing also, rather than thinking in terms of only production of housing units.
Yeah, and when I said affordable rental housing complex, the government is providing the financing. They're not creating the unit first. Second, you might want to look into the rental voucher policy of the US, one of the very successful, or rather few years successful policies of the US domestically, is where it has run for decades now, where they gave people, the poor people, especially the black Americans, African Americans, the rental vouchers, and they can move to different neighborhoods, and they can pay whatever they want to pay, but the rest of it will come from the voucher. The voucher was a certain fixed amount, right? So what people did was they moved away from neighborhoods which had poor schools or poor health facilities. They moved into better neighborhoods, and over, I think it's been just 20, 25 years, 30 years, over one generation, their health outcomes, educational outcomes, income outcomes drastically improved. So if you can move to a place and government could subsidize a part of it, is also one way. The US had success with the rental voucher policy. You might want to look at that.
My name is...
That will depend on the agreement between the tenant and the landlord. How long do they see?
Yeah. My name is Muralidhar Rao. I have been associated with Takshashila Institute already. Taking off from this voucher talk, and also now we have had this MNREGA for a number of years. Now Karnataka has introduced this Griha Lakshmi, and every state is, the elections are coming up. They're coming up with more and more of these payment vouchers, or whatever you're calling it. So is it now time for UBI, Universal Basic Income? That's my question. Thank you.
I'll try to do it. I think UBI is a great idea, but we don't have the money for it currently. So the way we conceptualize this is, it's like a trifecta. So if you have a universal income, it won't be basic enough. If you have a basic income, it won't be universal enough. And if you have a universal and basic, it won't be the income. You will have to provide something else. So that's where we are. So I think, probably it's not something that would be possible now, just because the revenue of government is not enough to provide a universal basic income. So most of the governments are not providing UBI, they are thinking of BI, right? Basic income, and essentially you will exclude a large number of people who the government thinks doesn't need this. Now, as a policy, it is fine, but this is not very different from the targeted PDS scheme, etc., which we already have, right? Again, the challenges there will be about how do you identify who are targeted, not targeted, what are the kinds of workarounds that people will find. So, but I think UBI conversation will gain strength over time. I think many countries in the West might introduce it. So it's okay to be, I think, on the follower end on this policy instead of being the first country to introduce.
Yeah. And if I may add, so you mentioned about NREGA. So NREGA is the rural scheme, right? And if you and there are a lot of proponents, instead of UBI, they say that we should have urban NREGA, which I think would be a disaster and would be sort of accepting the fact that our cities have failed to provide jobs, because the purpose of a city is to provide jobs, and in giving that distress employment, you are actually accepting that you are not able to give them enough employment. However, an urban NREGA, like just Griha Lakshmi, I think is targeted to certain sections. I think there's a lot of electoral sort of calculation behind it, and in terms of providing that income. But urban NREGA could be targeted on activities which have certain kind of positive externalities, right? For instance, in Karnataka case, I can actually think of restoration, rejuvenation, and creation of water bodies, urban water bodies. And if you do that, there's fair bit of positive externalities. Anyway, the people coming from the agriculture sector are engaged in the construction in the unskilled areas. If you can use them for an urban NREGA, which has a very certain positive externality, then you might use it. But again, it is a very limited end use there. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. So, question is to either of you because Singapore and equilibrium was mentioned. There's a 2015 article by Slavoj Zizek where he says that authoritarian capitalism is the new thing that will happen, and he's right in both in terms of Singapore, China, and India. It's somewhat happening, but they're not adapted totally. So my point was, if think tanks or any organization is mainly focused on individual growth, because whatever they want to solve immediate problems, small term, short term plans. So their goals will always be on an individual path. So the question will be whether it is capitalism without democracy or democracy without capitalism. So in that sense, how would you imagine a think tank, or why do you think such think tanks don't exist, where the focus is on capitalism with democracy is subsumed to capitalism and not the other way around? Because we have seen the last governments, we've seen this government as well focusing too much on politics, identity politics. So how do you see such a think tank where the focus is on long term, not the short term politics?
I think Pranay, it is your question.
Yeah, I think a lot of think tanks, I didn't understand capitalism without democracy part, but a lot of think tanks work on utilizing, improving the idea of capitalism, right? There are quite a few who are thinking about what are the benefits, what are, if there are some costs, how do you improve it, etc. So I don't think it's like lacking in any way. In fact, I mean, I would say the other way, there are not enough think tanks who are advocating that capitalism and wealth generation is good, it is beneficial. So that is still, we are in that process where now we are thinking about it, but it is in contrast with narrative in the West where people are also talking about degrowth, right? So the idea is, what you said is, one is important. In the last few years, yeah, we are seeing a lot of that access money angle where there is authoritarian thing, and more largely what you are talking about, a few markets which are having people concentrated players, so the idea is that is still a lot of thinking needs to be done how do you introduce competition in those markets. Like foundational AI is now another area where a lot of things are being talking about, or social media again. So how do you break that concentration, introduce competition is a central challenge. Lot of think tanks in the US, India, we also have a project on this, are working to think of this.
I mean, so far we've been talking about direct stimulation for economic activities or housing, but what's the larger role of the government in care activities? For example, there are social phenomena now where, less women after COVID would probably go back to work because of childcare. Single mothers are on the rise. Mental health for youth, and, the laddering that's required to bring these youth back to economic activity. More intervention for juvenile youth who might eventually turn antisocial. So these kind of indirect activities, but play a larger role in kind of creating engines for economic growth. And in India, we don't have a history of that because so far we still deal with poverty, and we don't hear the government speak so much about it. So I just wanted to know your view on that.
I can. So I would again think of this, all of these areas are different. So for example, low labor force participation, low WLFPR, is it a social failure or is it a government failure? I think a lot of us think it is largely a social failure, right? So the solution also probably has to come out of the society, right? So how is it that so a lot of the things that we are now discussing WLFPR is probably changing attitudes about how we are thinking about it, and that will probably lead to change. So it's easy for the government to introduce a policy like 6 months maternity leave, right? It will benefit a small section of people in the formal work labor force, but it can't benefit. So because it is a social failure in our understanding, the solution has to come from society. And a lot of those things are of that nature. Government can do some things at the margin, probably improve, reduce regulations, encourage things. For example, one very good study done by people at Trias was trying to identify all the labor sector regulations which prevent women from working in manufacturing. For example, lots of women can't work in night shifts in some states. You can't work beyond a particular time. They have systematically documented all those barriers which exist. So if you can remove that, then probably it will encourage. But just state doing that will not solve the problem, because the problem probably is of a society and deeper nature. So that's how I would answer.
One last thing that I'd add to that is that India has one of the most generous sort of policies around maternal care, child care, and so on. And in pretty much all countries, after the childbirth, you see the workforce participation rate sort of declines. And India is still, apart from the manufacturing question, the other question that we are staring at and we're not even able to solve is the female labor force participation rate hovering at around 18 to 22, 23%. And I think it's largely the case of society. But I'm very hopeful on a lot of things. In my book, I opt in for a lazy answer, and I say a lot of things will get resolved as India continues to grow and the per capita income goes beyond a certain level. It will resolve for a lot of problems, including pollution and so on. And it is one of those problems where I would defer to sort of India growing and so on, because as India grows, the cost of providing care for a child over the course will continue to rise up, the rents are going up, and so you have no option but to move to a double income household, right? Once your purchasing power increases, you also opt for a bigger house, or a house which has a separate unit, or a separate house altogether, right? So those are the things that will give much more independence to women, and they will eventually move out. And again, my book has a dedicated section on women-friendly cities and so on. And honestly, I got tired of that section because it was just refused to end, because there's so much to be done, right? Whether it's about transport, whether it's about behavior change, whether it's about locating literally the blind spot across cities, and how different cities have sort of tried to tackle it, and how our urban planning is very gender blind, and we need to sort of make it gender aware, so to speak. And so these are the things that can go at the city level. But I'm just saying that there's certain problems. And India is one of those outliers, actually. At this per capita income level, a lot of other countries have much more female labor force participation rate. And I think it has largely got to do with Samaj more than Bazaar or Sarkar. And eventually, when the cost of bringing up a child, renting a house, buying a house, owning a car will really go up, people have to move from being a sink to a dink, single income, no kids, to at least double income, no kids, or however many kids.
All right, so I think we are running out of time. So you spoke about being optimistic. So what gives you hope in the future of Indian public policy? What is the source of your optimism? And we'll end with that.
Because being pessimistic is a very dark place to be, and it is, and it requires a lot more effort, because pessimism worries you to an extent, and if there is action, if there's a fair bit of intent, if there's a fair bit of energy, and there's a fair bit of chaos, constructive chaos, then the only way from here is up. And I'm very, very optimistic. One of my professors is sitting at the back of the room, and I remember my conversation exactly 10 years ago with him about this. We actually discussed about it, that, what makes you hopeful and what makes you pessimistic and so on. I'm very, very optimistic, and that's why at a lot of places I've deferred to growth in per capita income, India's growth story, and a lot of factors coming together, and the fact that people stayed 1.5 hours to discuss policy, and we decided to write these policy books, and it is just all over constructive chaos that gives me optimism.
Yeah, I agree. I think the villain is not necessarily polarization, but apathy, and the fact that we don't have apathy and more people are participating and thinking about public policy, it will probably make the government respond to new things and new ways of doing things. So, and hopefully cities will improve, as you were saying.
They must.
And there
will
be some chief minister who will do the reform that you said.
Actually, I just want to defer to that point. Ordinance is also another way that we try to, as we try to approach the agriculture reforms through ordinance. I think that is another way to do it, but that would set us back in terms of constitutional norms, and that would create another set of problems. So that is also another way to do the devolution thing, but we shouldn't.
All right. Okay, with that, thank you all for coming on the midweek day, and we'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you.